Well, today on the show, I'm joined by Professor Eric Steinhart. Professor Steinhart has written a selection of books that all touch upon the subject of atheistic Platonism. This conversation, we hope, serves as a way for you to begin to understand how atheistic Platonism could be viewed as and used as a worldview to begin to understand who we are, where we are, and how we link into and interact with the world at large. It's a really interesting concept, and this video, I hope, serves as that introduction to slowly put the pieces together to, I hope, inspire you to go away and pick up one of Eric's books and check them out. I recommend starting with Atheistic Platonism and Manifesto, but if that's too much, you might want to check out the book that is on his website, which is free for everybody to download, called Ritual Kindles Vision. Anyway, all the links are in the description, so make sure you check out those if you enjoy this conversation. And if it's your first time here checking out the show, I'd ask you to hit the like button, and then if you're on YouTube, select the bell notification icon when you hit subscribe. That will mean you're reminded whenever we release a video here on the channel. And please consider who might find this to be a useful conversation and share it with them. We grow because you take the time to share our content with your friends, family, and followers, so we appreciate every time you do that. Anyway, enough of that. I hope you enjoy this conversation on atheistic Platonism with Professor Eric Steinhart. Cheers. Hello and welcome to the show. My name's Samuel, and today I'm joined by Professor Eric Steinhart. Professor Steinhart, it's great to have you on the show.
It's great to be here.
So we've spoken a couple of times in the past. This is the first conversation which is going to be going live to a general audience. So it might be helpful for the listener, for the viewer, if you just give us a quick overview about who you are and the work you do, if that's okay.
Yeah, well, I'm a professor of philosophy, and I'm mostly interested in new and emerging religious movements in the West. And the backgrounds of those. Lots of those movements have ancient backgrounds, and so that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in and anything like that. All the immense. We live in an age of extraordinary religious change. And people, of course, think about atheism and things like that, and that can get kind of stereotyped. But there's obviously emerging paganism. There's, of course, the constant background of sort of new agey things, and even stranger things. So I'm interested in all of it, right? The whole panoply, and a lot of it is old stuff that's kind of, it's like a lake that's going down, and the ruins underneath are being revealed. So there you go.
That's exciting. So you've written extensively on various topics, but the books that I've read of yours are Believing in Dawkins, Atheistic Platonism and Manifesto, and then I'm most of the way through Ritual Kindles Vision, which I find to be really interesting. It's almost like a blending of all the points into a really interesting sort of I don't know. I almost view it as like an algorithm, the way you've kind of structured it out. Anyway, so a lot of these sort of questions are going to flow into and from the sort of topics that you raise in that book. And I'm kind of hoping that this conversation serves the listener and viewer as a bit of a, I guess, an introduction to atheistic Platonism, and the sort of way that I'm going to kind of piece the questions, I hope will help people to kind of slowly begin to understand what Platonism is, what paganism is, and begin to kind of piece these things together and to kind of hopefully have the courage to go away and pick up one of your books. That's the plan anyway. So I guess kicking off from the top then, the sort of kind of idea of paganism, very often it's kind of coupled to this idea of power or nature and the gods. That's how it's classically understood. Kind of how do we begin to look at something like paganism, and potentially do we begin to try and uncouple it from those sort of core concepts?
Yeah, I think that's some really interesting questions. I mean, paganism is returning in the West in a lot of different ways, right? I mean, classically, there was probably the first to emerge as kind of Wicca and a kind of, yeah, a little bit made up, but and then now you have Norse and Germanic paganisms, which have really gained popularity, and there's Hellenic paganism. There's every flavor under the sun, and just also a very just generic kind of nature religion, nature paganism that doesn't necessarily go by particular ethnic labels. And I don't know that I mean old ways of thinking about the gods or something like that in pagan polytheism of days gone by. I don't think you find so much clarity about that in contemporary paganisms where there are lots of pagans that don't care much about gods, right? Or think of the gods in symbolic ways as symbolic of natural powers, or think of gods in other ways because they don't want to try to just have instead of just one Judeo-Christian god have like 20 of them, right? So I think what's interesting to me about that is ways of kind of re-enchanting nature and ways of, kind of living in the natural world in a more, pragmatically, sort of ritualistically enriched way, right? That could be all kinds of things, right? For instance, we talked very briefly earlier about like heavy metal music, extreme metal music, which often is very very pagan, and it might not be that it's like, oh, you should worship Thor or Athena or something, but it's a pragmatic kind of way of engaging with the extreme, liminal and sublime and beautiful aspects of human life, life, death, health, sickness, terror, horror, all these things. And it represents a very different way, I think, of humans being in the world, right? And that's the sort of thing I find fascinating. I'm, as a philosopher, of course, super interested in the beliefs that people have, but I'm also really interested in the aesthetics and the practices, symbols, images, music, drama, rituals, behaviors that people do to sort of set meanings in motion. Right? It's not, Protestantism is super about belief, and it's just super cognitive, and it's very much about what's going on inside your head. And whereas you know a Wolves in the Throne Room concert is a lot different, right? So, or even going out and walking in the forest in a kind of ritualistic way. At Highland concerts, a lot different too. So those are the kinds of things I'm interested in, and I thought, as I was observing the emergence of atheism, one of the first things that occurred to me is there's no atheist art. There's no atheist music. I mean, there's no, like, apart from words that are written on pages or maybe spoken, that's all there is to atheist culture. And I thought that's really interesting, which leads in several directions. But that's what I'm thinking of. I'm just interested in what people do and how new ways of being religious open up to new ways of being in the world.
So I guess part of me wants to ask them really around sort of rituals, around the sort of idea that I guess kind of I've been chatting to a few Catholic friends recently. They're talking to me about the sort of ritual that is mass for them, where they're the priest does this kind of ceremony, and bit by bit, kind of the bread becomes the body of Christ essentially, and there's this sort of ritual that they kind of take part in at the service of mass. are we kind of saying then that we want to uncover or reclaim various elements, and that's an importance within atheistic society? I've got quite a few questions that are going to dive into atheism as it's currently understood, but I think it's an interesting kind of point you're making, if that is the point, where we're actually saying that we need to begin to understand that for groups and individuals have meaning and purpose and ways of expressing themselves, ritual is a sort of key element and a key part to that. And we can see that through tons of cultures and different societies and different time periods. So kind of, are you saying that we should kind of commandeer or create rituals then to kind of begin to give atheists a way of having and expressing meaning and purpose and direction?
Sort of. I mean, I think that, atheism is just kind of, a gate out of Christianity, let's say. It's in many respects in the Anglophone world, it's an extreme form of Protestantism. It's kind of where Protestantism goes to end. And then what? Right? You can't live there. You can't stay there. Uh, that's why there just aren't that many atheists, right? It doesn't give you a culture. And it doesn't give you, again, symbols, art, music, dance, rituals, any of that stuff that you can really use to live, to raise your kids, to deal with the problems of practical life. Um, and that's not about, ethics. I mean, atheists can be just as ethical or more ethical than anybody else. But it's about, having, I mean, I'm not, I went with a friend to see, the band Heilung in concert. That was a huge ritual that they do. Fantastic, just transformative, amazing. And you're not gonna go to anything like that that's, atheistic, right? And of course, Heilung isn't telling me it's a band, right? A sort of dark folk band, Germanic, Norse, Viking kind of, sort of pagan, sort of naturey, but they're not asking me to assert to any propositions, to believe this or believe that. It's just you go to the thing and get swept up in the symbolism, and um, I think that that's just necessary, right? Humans are just, I don't. The problem with atheism for me is not a question of truth or falsity. It's that I don't want to be blind and deaf. You know, I want to have art. I want to have music. And so, and I like what that stuff shows me and tells me, right? And so I don't know if that answered the question. I don't know if that kind of got into some of the. We don't need to commandeer old stuff because people are constantly inventing new stuff, right? Just look, to go back to that theme. Look at the evolution of extreme metal music, where it started out, sure, a first sort of wave wasn't very coherent. Now you got this very angry anti-Christian sort of second wave, Norwegian and Swedish, burn the churches music. But people realize that's a dead end. It's a dead end. And so that can go in other different directions then, right? But just saying, oh, I'm against Christianity, it's like, well, once you're out, once you get out of the car, like, now where are you going to go? Right. So people are doing it, right? We don't have to commandeer anything that's old. People are always inventive. They're inventing new things.
Yeah, yeah, that's so interestingly said. So I think it's a really hard thing to define. I'm going to talk about religion now, but I think it'd be helpful to kind of begin to try and understand kind of what, what you think religion is then. So kind of, when I think of religion, I try to kind of categorize it. It's exceptionally difficult to do, right? It's almost like it's almost like trying to grab water with my hands. I'm always losing something when I'm trying to do it. But when you begin to look at things like kind of rituals and paganism and belief systems and identity and all these things, they all get wrapped up into one category sometimes, and that is a sort of religious zeal or a desire to kind of conform to a way of being. That's sometimes how I try to define it. But it'd be interesting to hear from you kind of how do you think we should be thinking about religion alongside things like paganism and atheism and Platonism?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I say things like I work on new and emerging religions, but I don't have a clue what religion is. And in a certain sense, that's probably a good thing, right? It's one of those things that I might say I know it when I see it, but that's kind of lame. Because you might expect a philosopher to like actually have a clearer understanding of what they're doing. But I don't know that it would help me to have a definition. I would worry that that might blind me to a whole bunch of stuff that I should be interested in. Right. I mean, I do know that when I see people doing certain sorts of motions with their bodies, with their hands, undertaking certain sorts of aesthetic behaviors or symbolic behaviors, probably that are symbolic behaviors that aren't, that don't have an obvious referent, right? Then I start to think, okay, that looks religious to me. So when, people dress up in as animals like furries, and they say I'm an animal, I'm this, or this is my true self, I'm not a human, I'm something else. I don't know if I should call that religion. I probably would, but it starts to become religious when they're asserting something that seems like it's obviously false, or it obvious doesn't have an obvious way of making sense. And it's also not just like a puzzle, right? Like a logic teaser or a brain teaser. It's sort of they're not doing it to be silly or just provocative, right? When I've seen things, I've watched some of the rituals that what is it in the UK there? Extinction Rebellion did has done, and like. Is there something religious about that? Well, there's people that dress up in sort of the same sort of costumes, and the costumes are really weird looking, right? They're not like anything anybody would wear in an ordinary context. And clearly, a lot of the scripted behavioral patterns they do are clearly rituals, right? And so I think for me, it's interesting to see humans doing these things and then to ask questions about what is the meaning of what they're doing, right? Like the furries when they think I'm an animal or something. Like, okay, is it a way of pointing beyond the limitations of their humanity? And does that point to something interesting that humans can do? Right. I mean, it's interesting that an animal could say, a human who's an animal can say, I'm not a human. Right. And intend it not as something just stupid, right? Where somebody could say something like, well, obviously, yeah, you're a human. Take a look at yourself, you featherless biped. Um, or with the Extinction Rebellion, they say, well, it's about climate change and stuff like that. And it's like, well, you don't have to dress up in these weird looking clothes to like talk about, the seriousness of climate change or to if it were just making a political point, there's probably a lot more effective ways to do it. Right. There's a symbolism in all these cases that's going way beyond anything we ordinarily symbolize. And I could say that that means it's going beyond the mundane or the profane or the empirical world or things like that. Um, and that's all correct, right? But when people are, instead of saying like, what's a religion, I usually think of acting religiously, right? When people are acting in a certain way, and probably almost always using symbols, right? It's symbolic, using either words or gestures or clothing or jewelry or movements of their bodies or sounds they make with their voices or with musical instruments or colors and pigments and painting or tattoos or doing things to their bodies. That's you know symbolizing in ways that are not ordinary, right? That starts to become um, religious behavior, I think. So
So I've kind of got one more question that kind of feeds into the idea of, I guess, kind of religion and paganism and rituals and potentially kind of brings them together. So say say you and me are at a gig, we're seeing Walls in the Throne Room, or a band that might be more helpful for this is something like Meshuggah. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they're quite a big band, quite old now. So we're basically at this gig, right? We've both got pints. We're stood at the back. We're wearing our metal t-shirts. You've got long hair. I've grown my beard long again, and we're just like absolutely getting involved with whoever this is that we're seeing. We're kind of taking part in kind of how we look. We're taking part in what we're wearing. We're almost playing a role of observer to the kind of band that are performing, and it's almost as if we're taking part in this sort of kind of religious ritual. Would you kind of begin to say that potentially somebody who is seeking music, seeking that communal element of partaking in something like going to gigs, to be a religious act, would you class it as that, or is it more of a ritual? I'm just trying to understand the difference, I guess.
Yeah, I think, particularly with music, right? It's going to be a continuum where there are some things. I mean, I've certainly gone to concerts where I think, well, there's nothing religious about this. This is just entertainment, right? I mean, there are, and then I think of concerts that I've gone to where, so I've seen Patti Smith live a number of times, and in her concerts, there are times when you just think this is just entertainment. It's I'm a big fan of Patti Smith, and I think it's just entertainment. And then there are other times in her concerts that I've seen, like the Horses concert, for instance, where you think this is just right. She goes into these some sort of trance. I mean, the best word people have used is it's shamanic. Like, and you realize that suddenly you're caught up in something that's no longer about. I mean, it's a transformative experience. Certainly an altered state of consciousness, and that again is unordinary, right? But some concerts or music events or any kinds of things, certain rituals, like a graduation ritual, I don't think they're religious. This is something you do. Certain political rituals, not religious. Um, but then, I mean, I did hear Wolves in the Throne Room a couple months ago, and I just thought this just is a religious event, right? I mean, this is now they have all kinds of stuff they have on stage, skulls and horns and candles and things that they're doing. But there are times in the music's being played that Wolves in the Throne Room, sort of black metal or some Cascadian black metal, whatever one wants to call it, where there's the body becomes, at least my body, and I think most other people's bodies there becomes altered, right? You're really not sure what the space is that you're in anymore, and uh, I wouldn't classify it as like ego dissolution like with psychedelics, but there is a sort of loss of self, or there's a reorientation just of your whole body towards something else, something that's present in the room. The music, I would say, is revelatory, right? What it reveals, I'm not sure. And I'm not sure I need to understand exactly what it reveals, right? But this music is not there as entertainment, right? Now, maybe some people just do find it entertaining. Uh, I went and heard Heilung too, actually, right before the pandemic. And I mean, the Wolves in the Throne Room concert, it's not super structured as a ritual. It's sort of got ritualistic elements. But the Heilung concert that I saw, Heilung, the neo folk band, that is structured as a ritual. Right? Their concerts are consciously, deliberately structured and performed as rituals. And if you ask them about, I've read their interviews, you say, is this, religious? And they'll be like, well, it's up to you. Right. And I understand their reasoning for wanting to be a little cagey. But certainly at the Highland concert, um, there were times, at least for me, when, of course, you're just caught up in the drumming, right? And it's because the drumming is super, super essential for them. And like just a complete loss of location in time and space, and not even the sort of, communal dissolution into, again, something's being revealed. You become part of something. It's easy to say, like, yeah, it's something greater than yourself. It's a little shallow to say that, I think. Um, but experiencing that kind of music seems to me to be definitely religious, and the experience of hearing it, seems to me, maybe it's just my personality, but I'm certainly not the only one who says, these are religious experiences, right? That's why people, go to hear Heilong, right? They don't go. It's not like going to a Bruce Springsteen or Billy Joel concert, or you know rock and roll, because it ain't that, right? Um, so people are making these things, and certainly, is it pagan or not? I don't know, and I'm not sure if that helps. I mean, but it is something that people are starting to think about, right? So there's a little take on music and ritual, and opening up to something else.
I want to invite you to join our community on Locals. There is a range of free and supporter-only benefits to check out. On Locals, you can ask guest questions, access the reading plan to prepare for upcoming conversations, get early access to all the full-length video and audio versions of each episode, and meet like-minded followers of the show. The link is in the description, and I hope to see you there. Yeah, it's really helpful. I mean, we could potentially apply the same thing to not just music, but to sports as well. I know a lot of people kind of get into the sort of rhythmic way of viewing sports, and we'll kind of leave it there. But it's interesting that there are these events which take place, which are so meaningful to individuals, but yet lack the idea of there being some sort of deity or something eternal or consistent that would require it to be like an actual kind of Christian event or something like that. But we'll kind of push into that in due course. I kind of want to turn to Platonism itself now, and kind of more looking at sort of historic Platonism. So Platonism's often linked to the idea of the good, or the notion of the good. And within Plato himself, he kind of speaks about sort of intelligence or reason, or nous. So could you explain what historic Platonism is, and kind of how nous runs through it? And then after that, we can begin to look kind of more modern day versions of Platonism itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think, ancient Platonism was a huge movement, that goes for, well over 1,000 years, in the pagan world. It's rich, it's complex. Certainly, you've got Socrates and Plato, those guys who have a pretty, I mean, once you really get into that, you realize just how alien sort of their culture was, and how, I mean, I want to say the word primitive, right? I mean, these are people that you realize, like, reading and writing hasn't been around for very long. And being able to think any kinds of abstract ideas is something really new for human beings, right? And making art, making statues, making music, things like this are very new. A lot of things, for Plato, I mean, Plato doesn't, like things that are pretty old, like astrology and magic, don't even really exist for Plato. They're new. Like, some Persian dudes are talking about the stars. What? Um, but it develops, right? And so, yeah, Plato thinks there's the good, right? There's the one. There is Socrates kind of has this idea of nous, a designing mind of some kind. Lots of these ideas are going to get systematized over the next 700 years, by people like Plutarch, and by Romans, right? I mean, it gets taken over by Romans, and they're going to systematize it. You get Plutarch, you get Plotinus, right? And then people like Iamblichus, Iamblichus in the 300s, Plotinus in the 200s, Plutarch in the 100s. So this is a long process. No need to get too much into the history, but it's a lot is going to change. And then by the time you get people like Proclus, I mean, you're already pretty much Christianized, right? By the late 300s, Christianity has taken over legally and politically the Roman Empire. Paganism, as Platonism as it exists, really looks like a kind of polytheistic version of Christianity. It's often hard to see, like, when you're dealing with somebody like Plotinus, you're really still dealing with a pagan, right? What's certainly interesting for me is just how bizarre he is, and also he's a good example, as is Iamblichus, of guys who got Christianized, right? They seem to be useful in some ways for the Christians. Augustine picks up Plotinus, becomes a Christian, converted away from Manichaeanism. But I'm not as much concerned with the historical particular details of Platonism as the ways that it's a framework, it's systematic, it combines a lot of things that people can use today, is how I view it. Right? I mean, you've got somebody like Plotinus, very heady, very abstract stuff, and yet at the same time, it's filled, and it's amazing. It's taken only within the last 20 years of scholarship for people to realize, for instance, that Plotinus, the Aeneid, his text is just filled with sex. And you think, well, Platonism's got to be very abstract and dry and anti-body, and people realizing it's filled with sex. It's filled with all this Gnostic ritual stuff, a lot of which was just, as some scholars have said nicely, under-translated. Like, you don't realize that these are words for sex acts. They're Baudelarized, right? They're made nice for the Victorian readership. So, when the one ejaculates, it's like, this is emanation, So, you start reading it in the light of these things and realizing that you have this incredibly rich system of, particularly in Plotinus, an extremely rich system of images and symbols. Anybody who likes psychedelics should read Plotinus. I don't know if that guy was using psychedelics, but the visions in that book, the Aeneid, are simply extraordinary, right? People taking off all their clothes and running into the temples naked to worship the statues in just plant, like there are these visions of plants, and you're like, this you would think, as people have said, right? People have written about DMT and other psychedelics, are like, who's the guy, Benny Shannon, who wrote his big book on DMT, right? He's like, yeah, this is basically Plotinus. I'm basically seeing everything, and he's read Plotinus. He recites it. He refers to it in his book on ayahuasca, right? He's like, yeah, I'm actually just seeing it now, right? And so I think that the Platonists are like that. They give you symbols, images. They give you a capacity to sort of organize images and to make sense of a lot of visionary experiences, and a lot of similar kinds of experiences, right? If you run the really heavy duty ritual stuff, you go to Iamblichus, right? Theurgy. And Iamblichus is really just writing about all these kinds of religious behaviors and rituals in late paganism, right, that aren't Christian. And he's really the only surviving. I mean, there are some obscure texts that, aren't translated, or, they're hidden away in France or something. But Iamblichus is the guy who's describing, pagan religious ordeals, and the rituals at the oracles, and magic, right? The meaning of the Greek magical papyri, and magical behaviors, the things that people are doing. That's really interesting to me because people do that stuff now. So that's, I see the Platonists as just an incredibly rich system of conceptual and aesthetic and practical resources, right? I mean, I spend a lot of time thinking about it, ways to interpret them, but that's because that's my job. I think anybody can pick this stuff up, make of it what you will. Um, I see it as just, this is stuff from the actual pagan world, right? From a pre-Christian world. Um, in many respects, it's almost all we've got from a pre-Christian world in the West, right? I mean, even Norse, the sagas, right? The Poetic Edda, the Prose Edda, they're already highly Christianized. People have certainly remarked on that. Like the figure of Thor has already been adapted to Christ, right? Ragnarok looks a lot like the Last Judgment. Loki looks a lot like the devil. Not quite, but these guys are already heavily Christianized. And those stories come to us several hundred years after the Christianization of Norse and Germanic cultures. So yeah, they capture some non-Christian paganisms, but um, I mean, they can be useful. But there you go. I mean, I think I look at Platonism as kind of a resource, right, to understand what people were doing in indigenous Western cultures.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So, I mean, kind of very often, kind of Platonism is viewed as this sort of, I guess, abstract object kind of way of being. And people talk about the abstracts of numbers. We could argue that value or morality could also be kind of tumbled into the sort of abstract space. I kind of want to, I guess, get your take on this idea of abstract objects and what they mean. I mean, so we could kind of look at this in two ways, that these things are there regardless of there being kind of humans to observe them, that it is just true that two exists. Or we could kind of go down a more sort of nominalist route, which is kind of saying that these things, these labels or these abstract objects are only really sort of names or labels upon something. So they almost need to have an interpreter or a viewer for them to hold weight or to hold meaning. So kind of, would you mind kind of breaking down this idea of sort of Platonic abstract objects and whether you think they are, I guess, consistent or eternal, or whether they do require a conscious mind of some sort to name or label them?
Well, I mean, sure. I think the stuff about abstract objects or the forms or numbers or things like that, I think it's a fascinating topic. I also think it can be distracting for people. And so people want to fight about whether they exist or they don't exist, or whether they're mind independent or not, and things like that. Uh, that can be interesting up to a point. So certainly for a lot of reasons, I think that abstract objects exist. They are mind independent. They do require us to name them and label them, right? I mean, if we didn't exist, we wouldn't call the number two with the word two, or zwei, or, dos, for whatever. Um, right. But the numbers, right? To my mind, what becomes interesting about abstract objects, first of all, it's a very distorted view of Platonism to think that abstract objects are somewhere else, that they're not in the same world that we're in. They're up in a Platonic heaven. I don't know where that view comes from, probably Bertrand Russell in his typical way of distorting history. You don't find it in the Platonists. Plotinus himself, for instance, says the forms are not up above. The forms are here. They're right here. When you go outside and you look at a tree, you look at one tree, you look at another tree, you see they have something in common, and it's a structure. And that structure, trees don't depend on me. That would be really narcissistic and arrogant for me to think that if there were no humans, there would be no trees. Yeah, and people are like, well, there wouldn't be anybody to call it a tree. And I'm like, yeah, so what? Who cares? The trees would still be there. And the forms and the pattern of the tree would still be there. One of the things that's interesting about humans, like many other animals, is we're sensitive to these patterns. We're not the only animals that are sensitive to these patterns, right? Birds sing songs. They're incredibly sensitive to song and melody and shape. Highly abstract shapes, right? The kinds of songs that birds produce are already highly abstract. It's music, again. Music fills the world. And so if I look at a tree, if I go outside and I look at trees, it's not long, if you're paying attention to trees, that you start to think of more general and, sure, abstract patterns. But this is looking at a tree. Looking at trees and wondering how they branch, right? I might realize that they branch in accordance with the Fibonacci sequence, right? There's a way that trees branch. Now, not all of them, right? Some branch according to other sorts of mathematical sequences, right? And if I look at flowers, if I look at the petals of flowers, right? The petals of flowers almost always are Fibonacci numbers, right? You got the Fibonacci series that starts with 1 and 1, and then each next number is the sum of the previous two. So 1, 1, 2, 1 and 2 make 3, 2 and 3 make 5, 3 and 5 make 8, and then we've got 13, 21, 34, a bunch more. And so the petals of flowers turn out to be Fibonacci numbers. Again, not always, but very often. And the branching patterns of trees, there are some trees that just branch in binary, right? They have a trunk, it branches into two branches, branches into two more each branch divides into again. Those aren't all that common. What usually happens is a kind of branching that again produces a Fibonacci sequence where, right, you start out with one trunk and then you get like two branches, and then on the next level there'll be three. And then on the next level, there'll be 5, and then 8, and then 13. And so if you're counting the nodes of the branching, you get a Fibonacci sequence. The math is there. Now, what's intriguing to me is the way that math now enables me to look at the natural world that's right outside, or that I'm holding, or like, if I'm going to be a good hippie and go hug a tree, I'm hugging the Fibonacci sequence. I'm suddenly connected, to my way of thinking, to something that is eternal. And this tree is now really taking me beyond its treeness in a way that's not taking me to some other world that's not Earth, right? It's showing me a depth in the physical reality around me. I think just physics does that. Physics is highly mathematical, right? It's showing you that there are deep, deep patterns in existence. And I think that can become, right, an interesting source of inspiration for art and for religious awareness and ritual practice. So that's maybe, I hope, does that answer some of those kinds of questions?
It does. I think it'd be interesting to kind of understand a little bit more about maths then. So kind of when you speak about maths, I guess there are sort of two ways that people usually come at this. They either say that maths is the underlying structure upon which reality then is built, whereas another group of people might say that maths is the language by which we navigate nature. Now, you might argue that both of those can be true, and that's okay. But it'd be interesting to really kind of hone in here on kind of what you're saying about maths and its place as either or both a foundation upon which everything is built, or an explanation or a way of talking about, almost like a language, a way of explaining reality as we interact with it.
Well, I don't think there's any contradiction between those two points of view. I mean, if I, use language like numbers or digits or words that I say, right, it would be very strange if the mathematical language that I use or scientists use, physicists, when they're doing, say, mathematical physics, it would be very strange if they were using a language that was false. And yet that language seemed to enable them to gain enormous mastery and technical control over the world to make true scientific predictions and come up with true explanations for why things happen. But the language isn't describing anything at all. That would just seem to be worse than magic, right? That wouldn't even be miracle. That would be absurd, right? That would be like saying, like, I mean, why can't you use poetry to describe the world in a way that gives you technological control and scientific predictability, right? Why can't you use any language at all? Because obviously the language doesn't have to be true. People who talk like that, right? Who think, if you think math is just a language, and that it's not describing anything that actually exists, then it's a real mystery for why it works, right? That would be like saying, I go into my automobile and I perform these operations and drive it around, even though there's no steering wheel, there's no wheels on the road, the gas pedal doesn't actually give it more gas, the brakes don't slow it down. This is all just a language. It's all just a language. And none of the things I'm talking about are real. Car is just a word that humans made up. Steering wheel is just a word. And I have this language, but there's no car, there's no steering wheel, there's no road. And so that just seems absurd to me, right? And people get hung up on this in ways I don't understand. Like, I know that the number, that the word one, O-N-E, is a word. I know the word dog, D-O-G, is a word, but I know that, dogs aren't words. And why anyone would think that numbers are words is just beyond me, right? That would be you might as well make up nonsense syllables, right? Complete nonsense syllables, and see if that would help you understand and technologically manipulate reality. And of course, the answer is obvious. It wouldn't. The only reason, that things like mathematical physics are effective is because the structures they describe actually exist. If they didn't exist, the mathematical physicists wouldn't be talking about anything. I mean, it'd be very weird to say, like, oh, a four-dimensional intrinsically curved space-time is just a bunch of words, and then use it to, predict an eclipse. I would find that to be stranger than a miracle. Maybe then you really would need a god, right? Who could say, like, oh, I'll take what the humans are saying and make it happen, right? Now I don't think there is any such god, so I don't have that miracle to appeal to. So yeah, I don't a lot of me is just baffled by the way people talk about these things. But I think, again, it comes from a certain Anglophone, philosophy, people like Bertrand Russell, A.J. Ayer, and maybe David Hume, folks like that, who aren't actually coherent. So that's my little take on that.
Yeah, I often wonder whether people are just getting themselves lost or confused here. Like an example that I like to use sometimes is that it's possible to put a satellite into orbit just based on Newton's laws of motion. Like that is something that it is possible to do. Where obviously Einstein's theory of general relativity has surpassed Newton's laws of motion and kind of helps us to understand far more about the universe. And I think sometimes people realize or notice things like that. I'm not saying it's right where they go, but they begin to question whether it is true that mathematics is the code upon which everything is built, or rather it's true that mathematics helps us to interprets the sort of way that the world is structured. And again, as you already said, those two things don't necessarily have to be in conflict, but at times people look at a theory like Newton's laws of motion and it's surpassed by something else, and they think, well, therefore it's wrong and we can't necessarily trust the math side of it wholly. I don't know, what are your thoughts on something like that?
Well, I mean, Newton's laws, for instance, are just an approximation of of Einstein's laws, right? Einstein didn't, just throw Newton away, right? I mean, the Einsteinian concepts refine and extend Newtonian physics to, to areas that Newton himself never could have thought about, right? Newton didn't have the data, right? The observations, and Newton, of course, didn't also have the mathematical tools, right? But to extend your satellite example is a really good one because, yeah, you really only need Newtonian physics to launch, Sputnik or, some early satellite. But if you're using GPS, like with your phone, right, and satellites, GPS satellites, that requires general relativity and quantum mechanics, right? Because you actually have to take into consideration the speed of light and the speed at which signals are moving. And in your phone or a regular computer, things are happening on such small scales and so fast that our computing systems rely on quantum mechanics. My little laptop here relies entirely on quantum mechanics for its memory, right? Electron spin states, all kinds of things like that, and the just the fact that it works at all requires taking quantum mechanics into account, right? Because of the speed at which signals are moving and how close it is to the speed of light, right? And the ways that you could get certain kinds of interference effects or other things like that. I don't need to go into the details. But if that stuff wasn't actually describing structures that really exist, it would be, again, an utter miracle why you could build a computer or have, GPS, right? But it's not a miracle, right? It's because the structures described by general relativity and quantum mechanics actually exist in the physical universe. They're not somewhere else. They're not out in some weirdo transcendental heaven. The satellites are orbiting the Earth. They're here, right? The curve, we live in the curved Einsteinian space-time. That four-dimensional Minkowski space isn't somewhere else. I'm sitting in it, right? So, and I think that thinking those kinds of things through um, gives you an enormous amount of conceptual and aesthetic resources for making art, for having visions, for thinking new kinds of thoughts about nature and how we live in it and move through it. Right. So I wouldn't want the abstract stuff to just be, mental and heady or just technical where like, oh yeah, all you can do with this is use it to launch a satellite. Right. And it would require a little talk, but I think things like High Longer Wolves in the Throne Room really actually couldn't exist if you didn't have that kind of sophisticated mathematical culture. So I'll leave that at that.
No, it's so interesting. I kind of, I could hear people in the background. I can't actually hear them, but metaphorically, people in the background saying about, how are these numbers substantiated? Like, what comes behind them? And I want to get to the iterative hierarchy of sets in due course. But I think the sort of kind of final piece I want to pull in before we dive into atheistic Platonism as per se would be to kind of talk about atheism itself and kind of just really finish off grounding that down, and then we can kind of push into the sort of final phase then. So I guess kind of, I really admire Graham Oppy's kind of way of defining atheism, which is essentially just somebody that assents to the statement that there are no gods. It'd be interesting to kind of understand, Eric, kind of from you, how you define atheism, if that's something you're able to do for us, but also kind of why you think atheism is actually almost like a culturally Christian thing. You've already mentioned that kind of it's like at the end of sort of Protestantism, you get to atheism as the final stop for that thing. Like that's where it gets to eventually. So kind of could you just really hammer home for us how you define atheism and also kind of where you see it within the culture and why you think it is potentially a Christian thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think just simply from the word, atheism is a denial of theism. So, okay, there's no theistic gods. Um, I certainly don't think that, right? I suspect that Graham Oppy thinks all gods are theistic. I'm not sure if he thinks that anymore. I think he used to, but I certainly don't think that all gods are theistic. Meaning that they're like, disembodied minds or bodiless intelligences or something like that. As far as that goes, I don't think any such things exist. Um, but I think it is a kind of hyper Protestantism. That's not a thesis that's original to me. There were a bunch of anthropologists and sociologists who came up with that idea. They were particularly looking at the way, analyzing a lot of the new atheism and looking at it from a kind of cultural historical perspective, as anthropologists do, taking communities of atheists sort of as a tribe of humans and what their beliefs and behaviors are. And the first thing, of course, to observe right away is that atheists in the Anglophone world are obsessed with belief, and they're obsessed with correct belief. Right? Atheism really is a matter of having correct belief, and that atheism is incredibly opposed, right, in the Anglophone West, right? Because there are other forms of atheism, in Hinduism and other contexts that I'm not talking about. Um, you know, it's very opposed to anything like rituals or symbols or images or music or performance or anything that's not pure words and or not about belief. And so reading what these anthropologists and sociologists were saying, I started to think like, yeah, wow, these guys are right. Like atheism in the West, in the English speaking world, right, it emerges from a kind of Protestant culture, and it's a real extension of Puritanism. It's a real extension of just purifying religious behavior so much. And a lot of Protestantism began with saying Catholicism is idolatrous. Right? Catholics have these saints that they seem to venerate or worship. They have statues. They have these pagan rituals and behaviors. The priest says magic words, and the early Protestants rebelled against the pagan elements in Catholicism. And so we have to purify Christianity of these pagan elements that are still in the Catholic world. Right. Well, and a lot of that was saying this is idolatry, right? Catholics are idolaters, right? Mary is an idol. The saints are idols. These statues that they have in their churches are idols. The Mass is an idolatrous pagan performance. The miters, the hats. This is Mithraism. It's idolatry. Um, they're worshiping, the relics of saints and things like that. Again, idolatry. And Protestants were like, we just got to get rid of all this idolatry. And atheists just said, yeah, let's just keep going, right? This extreme prohibition against idolatry and an extreme view of, right, let's say religious practice, right, where you purify everything until you finally just say, look, God is an idol. Let's be so. This is and this appears in Christianity, right? And people like Thomas Altizer, who was a teacher of mine, right? The death of God theology, right? Where you just say, like, eventually you got to purify Christianity even of God, right? Because God just becomes another idol. And so um, it's a continuation of the trajectory that starts with the Protestant rebellion against Catholicism, and it just hypes up on itself until eventually um, all that's left is a kind of purity of words. And that also struck me as very, and I wrote a book on dealt a lot with Dawkins. It's critical of Dawkins too, but dealt a lot with the new atheists. And again, it's like, well, why is it, it's all just negative. I understand, like, people are angry with Christianity, or they're troubled by they used to be Christians, it was traumatic, or Christianity does bad political things, they don't like it. Um, but why not go like into, why not do something else? Why not become uh, a Norse pagan or a Wiccan or New Age? What, like, you don't need God in any of those things. So why don't they do that? So that all, I don't know if that helps, but that's how I think of atheism. I thought of it as an extreme. Again, it's not original to me, right? I had to be persuaded of this. That it's an extreme Protestant sect, and it exists within Protestant culture. And apart from sort of saying, from being a Protestant sect, I'm not sure that it has any future. So, and I don't think it's about, not believing in any gods, right? I think that's a slogan for not participating in a whole sort of range of behaviors, and for having an extraordinarily intense policing of a kind of purity, right? Where what we do to prove a kind of tribal allegiance or tribal membership is we focus extremely intensely on rituals that are carried out simply with words. Um, and it is magic. It's a form of magic. It's a form of magical practice that um, is using words, right, as having certain types of power. Obviously, not the power to say a magic spell and, cure your headache or something. But the way that atheist discourse uses words, it uses words as magical tools, right? I mean, what do we use magic for, right? I have demons in my closet, or demons down in the basement, and I need to get rid of them. Or, in my, my kid is possessed by the devil. And so I use magic incantations and words to get rid of the demons. Fine. This is exactly what atheists do. Well, what are the demons? The demons are all the old superstitions, right, of religion, right? Christianity, Catholicism in particular. Um, these superstitions that haunt our minds, the bad beliefs that harm our cultures, create bad politics and injustice. And some of that you want to say, like, yeah, sure, that's great. Get rid of that stuff, right? But the way we can get rid of that stuff, atheists believe, is through words, right? In fact, despite scientific evidence that says that's not true, right? That people don't respond to words that way. Write another book about how God doesn't exist, and this is literature. That's the other thing with atheists. I was like, why are atheists constantly talking about God? This was baffling to me. It seems to me if you're an atheist, you should never use the word God at all, right? I mean, I haven't written books about how there are no leprechauns. I just don't talk about them. They don't concern me. And people have pointed this out too, that atheism is a kind of extreme apophatic theology, right? Negative theology, where negative theology was denying all sorts of things to God because you don't want to say too much about God, or you will make God into an idol. So finally, why don't we just deny existence to God? That's the best way to ensure that God can never be turned into an idol, right? And it's not just the recent atheists who say God doesn't exist. You find all sorts of Christian mystics who say Meister Eckhart, Jakob Burma, all kinds of Pseudo Dionysus, right? All sorts of people say like, yeah, God doesn't exist, right? Thomas Altizer, right? Even Paul Tillich, and so atheism is entirely within that Christian vein. And at a certain, I can't read atheist books anymore because all they do is talk about God. And I'm like, not interested. So there's a little take on atheism.
If you're watching this, then I just wanted to let you know that you can access the same content in audio-only form by subscribing via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Audible. In fact, you can search for the Socratic Sessions in your favourite podcast app, and whilst you're there, please leave a 5-star review. It helps others to discover these conversations. All links are in the description, and thank you. It's very challenging, I'll be honest. I think challenging to my own journey as well, which I won't dive into right now, but it's so interesting how you're kind of saying it's almost like the complete working out of this sort of almost Protestant ideal of removing idols. But also I think that kind of can be also phrased as the ideal of only believing that which is true, or trying to believe as many true things as possible. And as you kind of slowly kind of march down that road, you begin to recognize that more and more kind of slowly drops away. It's like, I've recently been kind of looking at various Buddhist texts. I'm kind of still on the sort of journey of exploring the space, and I kind of actually started with Hume, and this entire idea of kind of the self not being a single identifiable thing, but actually Hume talks about kind of multiple selves being within us. Then obviously the sort of Buddhist tradition could go into this idea of self just being a complete illusion, like ego being this manifestation that isn't even true, and just things like that I find very, very challenging. But I guess it's a question that probably isn't the right time to answer, but part of me wants to kind of say, like, kind of what's the dividing line between trying to believe as many true things as possible and also stopping walking down the sort of extreme Protestant road of removing idols or removing things which are false? Like, is there a dividing line between the two of those? And I guess I can kind of throw this question back to you with the sort of top spin on it of kind of, it also seems true that Judo-Christian influences have heavily affected philosophical frameworks, and we're still trying to untangle ourselves from those. How do we navigate that entire space, Eric?
Well, I think, given the size and scale of Christianity, something that's had influence for 15 centuries in the West, that's going to take a long time to kind of untangle
Yeah.
it. And things don't exactly get untangled, right? I mean, it's just going to evolve into something new, right? Where certainly there are good things in Christianity, and hopefully those good things can be preserved. There are bad things, and hopefully they're left behind. But believing that a whole bunch of things are true, or wanting to believe what's true, doesn't mean that you should take the view that's, for instance, every meaningful question can be answered by science, right? Or every meaningful question is empirically decidable, right? Scientifically decidable. Because that's a statement of faith. And I think that as one tries to find what's true, right? So I'm not simply a cognitive animal, right? I do have a brain, I think, but I'm not just a cognitive animal. And the way I encounter truth isn't just by thinking thoughts or saying words, right? Propositions that are true. I mean, I see things. I see trees and plants and birds. I hear the birds, right? I walk through the forest as a terrified predator. And that's experience, right? And it's not simply experience as like a sensory, like entertainment kind of thing. It's experience that's filled with meaning, right? The meanings that I take to hearing birds or to walking through the forests, or the meanings that I put into them, or the meanings that I put into making symbols or engaging with music or art, right? Truth is functioning in all of that, but it's not functioning linguistically or propositionally, right? It's functioning in different ways. And it's not just, in fact, at some point, truth is left behind, or truth is, I don't want to say superseded exactly, but other values. I mean, truth and beauty and the good, they're always there together. But sometimes beauty comes to the fore, right? Truth is not the only, for Platonists, right? Not the only highest value, right? Beauty and the good are also there. So the beauty of plants and animals in the natural world, or the beauty of art and the beauty of music, or one can ask questions about mathematics, whether it's true that mathematics exists. Fine. One can also wonder whether the Fibonacci sequence is beautiful, right? Whether the patterns that are revealed by mathematical cognition are beautiful patterns. The answer, which is usually yes. And so one can see what one is doing, right? Even in doing philosophy, right? A lot of philosophy is modeled as if it were a kind of science. But you can also think of philosophy as a kind of art, as making artworks, and art made with words, but also with images. But the beautiful and the good, right, are there too, right? One could just walk through life trying to maximize truth, while also having no concern for beauty or for goodness or justice, right? One could maximize truth while also maximizing injustice, right? Truth by itself is not an adequate way to live. And in part, that's because truth by itself is not the only highest good, right? It's one of the highest goods, and the highest goods are all interrelated with each other. But this is partly where I think atheism, as an extreme Protestant sect, really did go off the rails, which is to say that, yeah, not just truth, but a conception of, because, you can't say what truth is, or you end up immediately in paradoxes. So the atheist said, well, we'll just substitute empirical decidability for truth, or scientism, and that already has degraded the truth. But it's also a way of saying we're going to ignore beauty, and we're also going to ignore goodness, right? I think people are sensitive to this. I think that that's why people, kind of are skittish about atheism, right? And again, it's not that atheists can't be moral. It's just that you don't see atheists saying like, well, our primary concern is going to be for the good. And we'll let what truths fall out that may fall out of that, right? But what we're focused on is the good, right? Because that would be different, right? Because then you'd start to see a greater concern with action, right? We would start doing things instead of being just concerned with theories. Uh, the I'm tempted to talk about what you said about Buddhism, but I didn't know if you wanted to ask another question or.
I have more questions, but no, go for it. It'd be interesting to hear your take on that for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think westernized, I think what you do see then is you see people who, left Christianity in the West, right? And some of them say, and again, once you say, if you say, I've come to the conclusion that Christianity just doesn't work for me anymore, I'm not a Christian anymore, right? It seems a little odd to me that you would persist in writing books about how there is no God. It seems to me that you would say, well, I'm going to do something else, right? And I think a lot of people do that, right? I mean, there are probably three largish areas. People turn to sort of New Age stuff. New Age practices, in fact, are enormously popular in the West as well as elsewhere. It's not really an identity, right? Well, they're popular whether we like them or not. Um, it's not really an identity so much as just stuff people do. They might do them thoughtlessly. You have paganism, then, which is a pretty minority kind of thing, right? There are various sorts of pagan things that lots of people are increasingly aware of, but in most places, even in the United States, it's going to be hard to find a Wiccan, and it's going to be even harder to find somebody who practices, say, Asatru, right? Norse pagan. You might see some Thor's hammers on people. You're certainly a lot more likely to see people wearing, crystals around their neck, right? Um, and the third big option, I think, in the West really is Buddhism, right? Westernized Buddhism and some similar westernized practices like westernized yoga. And I say westernized Buddhism and westernized yoga because both of those really are very different from, say, the forms that emerged in India or that you find in Asia. Uh, but that's okay. That's religions go all around and change. Um, that is a very large. That's a way that Buddhism makes sense, at least in the United States, which is a highly Protestant culture. Buddhism makes sense in a Protestant context. And it's easy for people to move into it. And I say this sitting just outside of the Catskills Mountains in New York State. The Catskills, a group of mountains in upstate New York, uh, has the second largest concentration of Buddhist institutions in the world, after where the Dalai Lama lives in India. And so you walk around here, you go to the bookstore, you go to the religion section. It's interesting because it'd be hard to find a Christian book. It's all either Buddhism or New Age or occasionally a little generic kind of paganism, in a mixed up sense, tarot cards or yoga or something, and it's all mixed up, right? That's the beautiful thing about New Age pagan stuff. It's like, yeah, you can have some crystals and astrology and tarot cards, and you don't have to be too serious about it. It can be beautiful stuff. Um, I don't know anything about using tarot cards, but I collect tarot decks because some of them are just so gorgeous. And there are artists who I know who make specialized tarot decks that are just works of art. Um, and so, I think probably you've got those three ways to get out of Christian culture in the West: um, New Age, pagan, and Buddhist. And at least in the United States, Buddhism and New Age are just thriving. Paganism less so, right? It's probably easier to be an atheist Buddhist because Buddhism just doesn't believe in a creator God to begin with. Um, it's pretty easy actually to be an atheistic New Ager, right? People who are into the New Age, most of them don't believe in God. They might believe in some sort of universal energy or life force or essence or some vague animism. And some of them might say that's God, but most of them, God's just not relevant, right? Or nothing like a Christian God, a sort of vaguely pantheistic and maybe vaguely Neoplatonic God, but it's nothing like a Judeo-Christian or Islamic or Abrahamic God, right? These folks aren't reading the Bible, that's for sure. Uh, so the which was interesting to me to think about atheism and think like, most New Age stuff is atheistic, and most Buddhism in the West is atheistic, right? So who are these other atheists who are just writing constantly about God? Anyway, yeah, I mean the Buddhist stuff is very the westernized Buddhist stuff very interesting and very interesting how people are developing that and getting into it. So yeah, maybe maybe we're all going to be Buddhist in 20 years. I don't know.
Sitting cross-legged on mats, thinking about how nothing exists. Okay, cool. I mean, so kind of, I guess, just speaking now about atheistic Platonism itself, you kind of make two claims. I use the term claim loosely. One is that atheistic Platonism is or offers a solution to almost nihilistic atheism, the place where atheism can very often end up for individuals. You also make the claim that atheistic Platonism is a threat to theism. So it'd be interesting to kind of hear you, Eric, speak about this idea of atheistic Platonism offering a solution to nihilistic atheism, and then atheistic Platonism being an actual kind of tangible threat to the classic theistic positions.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that Platonism gives atheists, atheistic Platonism, right? Gives Platonists, gives atheists lots of structure that they really need. I mean, classically, um, again, in the Anglophone West, right, there's problems in atheism or naturalism with, the four M's, right? Mentality, morality, modality, possible and necessary. And did I say morality? Well, so uh, oh, what was the fourth M? Oh no. Anyway, right? Atheistic Platonism can give you a way of talking about objective morality, right? And it's not grounded in God, right? But it's grounded in objectively existing. In this case, it's going to be modal structures, right? Obligation, what's obligatory, what's permissible, and what's forbidden. Those are modal notions, right? Um, and I don't want to get too technical, but right, one of the things that uh, unfortunately I think a lot of atheists say, and it's they might as well just stop because it's a path to total failure. Is there's no objective morality. We just make up morals. Now there are a lot of reasons why I don't think that's not true, and there's a lot of reasons why lots of people think that's not true. Usually the arguments against it are pretty shallow, like, there's moral disagreement. It's like, yeah, there's disagreement in science too. There's disagreement about, how to load the dishwasher. That doesn't mean like you can't load it. So, all right. I think you get like objective morality, and I think that that's essential, right? People feel at least a need that there are moral standards. And Platonism gives you a route to that is ultimately very scientific, right? It's not opposed to science. It's not opposed to the scientific study of human behavior and moral patterns, right? Platonism also gives you that other M, modality, ways of thinking about what's possible and what's necessary. And with modality, you also get imagination, right? You get the ability to think of alternative worlds, to think of other ways things might be, including in particular ideal ways things might be. And that's very important for thinking about morality and particularly thinking about justice, right? Justice is usually understood and thought about in terms of, ideal worlds, right? What would an ideal world be like? Even if we can't get there, that's fine because you can still say we're only human, right? And right from the crooked timber of humanity, nothing straight was ever made, right? As Immanuel Kant said, but we can still try. But what are we trying for, right? And so modality gives you a way of thinking about other possible worlds that are not like this world, including worlds that are ideal worlds, worlds with justice, worlds where justice is in force, right? And worlds where it's not just might makes right, right? Might doesn't make right, something else makes right. Well, what is that? And Platonism gives you a way of thinking about that. I don't want to underestimate the fact that Platonism gives you ways when you get modality, you get imagination. And with imagination, you get art, right? You get ways of, for instance, I'll go back to the heavy metal music, extreme metal. Most of that wouldn't make sense without certain concepts of transcendence. And you don't have to go down the path of Hunt Hendrix's, manifesto on transcendental metal, black metal. But she was right to think that as black metal evolved, it became more oriented towards something transcendental. And that's why it has aesthetic value. And that's why it's beautiful, right? And it gives you a way of suddenly understanding what's going on in a whole culture. So, and Platonism was obsessed with music, right? Plotinus, for instance, and Plutarch, by the way, right? Plato himself was very interested in music, but actually, music's not very well developed in Plato's day. By the time of the Roman Empire, you really do have better musical instruments and performance and stuff like that. And so, folks like Plutarch and Plotinus just obsessed with music. It's a musical world. And so, and also art, again, visual art, painting, and things like that, right? You get all sorts of ways of living, right? That involve the use of symbols, that involve, practices. Now I can start to think about rituals. I can start to think about performance. And you can start to even, you can include, Buddhist stuff in that too, various forms of meditation, various other kinds of practices, right? So, although I think the Buddhist stuff would probably go in a different direction eventually, or maybe not. That remains to be seen. Did that help clarify any of that?
I think so, yeah. And I think one of the sort of, I guess one of the classic pushbacks that you might often hear on this subject, it really is about, I guess, instantiation. So this sort of notion that there needs to be something which is going to be able to get us from nothing to something, right? You see this in a lot of kind of classic arguments for the existence of God. In your books, Believing in Dawkins, Atheistic Platonism, and Ritual Kindles Vision, you use this phrase, which I love, and I'll kind of read it here. The self-negation of non-being is being itself. I think it'd be really helpful, if it's at all possible, for you to kind of expound the sort of logical point and help us to understand how self-negation of non-being gives rise to something, i.e. being itself.
Yeah, sure. Now that, it's important to say that idea is not original with me. It might be a very old idea. It might go back to the Gnostic writer Basilides, but Basilides is we don't have a lot of good texts from Basilides. We just have things people said about him. It may be developed in people like, the Pseudo-Dionysius, maybe Meister Eckhart, but probably the first person you find it in is Jakob Böhme. And, he was in the 1500s, early 1600s, a German mystic from the Palatine in Germany, where my ancestors are from. And so he has this view that you can't start with something, right? Whatever you start with, even if it was God, would require some explanation. And so if you're going to start, you start with nothing. And so how does nothing give rise to something? Well, the only way for nothing to give rise to something is for it to negate itself. I mean, nothing can't cause something to exist, right? Nothing isn't anything, right? Nothing doesn't exist, right? So if you say nothing is non-being, well, how do you get being from non-being? By negation, right? Not non-being is being. So that idea that nothing, and why say nothing negates itself? Because nothingness, right? It's probably better to say nothingness, just because English doesn't have good words here, right? Because I can say things like "there's nothing to eat in the fridge," and I don't literally mean that there's nothingness in the fridge, right? I just mean there isn't anything to eat in the fridge, a quantificational use of nothing. Right, so I'll say nothingness. Nothingness is it doesn't exist, and it doesn't exist absolutely. Right, it's not empty space. It's not the empty set. It's not the number zero. It's not the abs. It's not like that physicist Lawrence Krauss was like, oh, nothing. That's just quantum fields without particles. No, nothingness doesn't have any quantum fields. It doesn't have space. It doesn't have time. It's not anything at all. Its notness is absolute. And to think of that absoluteness, right? The notness of nothingness, its negativity. The negativity of nothingness is absolute. And if that negativity is absolute, it's universal. Right? That's all nothingness does. I mean, and I don't even like to use the term does, right? Nothingness simply negates. It's universal negation. And if its negation is universal, then it includes itself. It negates itself. In a certain way, that's saying nothingness is impossible. Nothingness negates itself. And the self-negation, since nothingness is absolute, it's extreme, right? What does the absolute negation of absolute negativity give you? It just gives you being itself. Right? Nothingness is not the absence of this thing or that thing. And so its negation isn't going to be the presence of this thing or that thing. Right? Nothingness is absolute absence. And its self-negation is going to be absolute presence, just being itself. Being itself is going to have, we're going to face it. Now we face actually the serious problem, which is how do you get beings from being itself? But there are lots of people in contemporary logic, for instance, Graham Priest, who's by all accounts the greatest living logician today, right? He picks up this line actually from a Buddhist angle, right? And he's gotten into some of the Western mysticism on this, that nothingness negates itself. I mean, Martin Heidegger wrote about this too, right? The nothings, it said, which Carnap, right, the positivist, mocked. And then ironically, Carnap immediately realizes he has to introduce a null symbol into his logical calculus. So Heidegger got his revenge. But yeah, the notion that non-being negates itself and not non-being is being. But that negation is purely logical. It's not causal. Nothingness doesn't have any causal power. Being itself is not an effect of the self-negation of non-being. It just is the self-negation of non-being. And that, in a certain sense, that's tautological, but it's a powerful tautology, right? That because it's not, it gives you an analysis of being itself, right? Being itself is the self-negation of nothingness, the self-negation of non-being. And that's immediately going to yield certain logical truths, right? That so nothingness is absolutely unproductive. Well, the absolute negation of what's absolutely unproductive is going to be absolute productivity. Nothingness is absolutely negative, and the negative of the negative is the positive. And some of this is a little trivial, and as it should be. It should be trivial at the beginning, because at the very beginning you don't have anything to work with except basic concepts, and negation is really the only basic concept that doesn't require a further basic concept. You can start with negation, right? You can't start with God, because then you immediately have the question, well, why is there God? Why is there God rather than no God? You can't start with something, because whatever you start with, you have immediately the question, why is there that instead of nothing? So start with nothing. And, the only way to move now is through negation. And actually, this is really good logic. I mean, it's a very interesting way of thinking about the foundations of logic. Graham Priest, again, has worked that out in fascinating ways. He takes it in a Buddhist direction. He's a practicing Buddhist. I would take it in a more Platonic direction. So, yeah, there you go with the self-negation of nothingness.
That's so interesting. And then you kind of mentioned beginning to actually build upon itself there. And you have this idea of kind of you kind of use the idea of the iterative hierarchy of sets. So I think it'd be helpful to explore this idea of a sort of almost like a Platonic Pythagorean metaphysics that's being kind of substantiated through, I guess, set theory would be the best way to describe it. And this sort of idea that we have the spark in the engine to ignite stuff to actually build upon from this stage onwards. You kind of explain this really interestingly in Believing in Dawkins, as you talk about basically you move into how the universe was created, how stars are pumps, and you kind of talk about how these sets are there but aren't actual tangible things, but in and of themselves begin to build tangible property. So would you mind I'm aware that we're kind of pushing time, but just exploring that a little bit for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think physical structure, right? I think physical structure is mathematical structure, right? Like the cosmologist Max Tegmark says. There are things Tegmark says I don't agree with, but right, that all physical structure is mathematical structure, and so right, once you start to see the elaboration of when you see being itself producing the beings, right, and the way it produces the beings. And again, this is not original with me, right? Some of it's original with me, but most of this comes from some others, right? That you think about basic operations of negation and affirmation, right? You've got negation already. The negation of the negation is affirmation. It's the positive. You've got two operations now, negation and affirmation, basically selection and rejection and selection, right? And through this, you can build up what mathematicians call the iterative hierarchy of sets, right? Essentially binary numbers, right? That's also a very old idea that goes back to the ancients. The ancient Platonists actually used odd and even to simulate binary numbers. They didn't have a binary number system. They actually didn't have any number system at all, but they used a notion of division by odd and even to be able to simulate binary arithmetic, which is very interesting. And Leibniz, of course, picks up on binary arithmetic he's the first one to really start to formalize it, right, and come up with a binary number system and be able to do arithmetic with it. And he's thinking about computers, right? So as soon as you've got selection and rejection, you get binary numbers. You got binary numbers. You're immediately going to be led into computation. And now you can start to think about the way computation drives physics. And you can start to think, as many people do, that our universe is a computational system. And there's all kinds of ways to think about that doesn't simply mean it's a video game or something, right? Or simulation hypothesis. But you can move from, this very basic logic about nothingness and being itself into mathematics, into computation, and then into physics. And then, of course, chemistry and biology and the other sciences and the world we see around us. And, I really would like to stress that none of this is somewhere else, right? When you look at the tree in your backyard and you realize, Plotinus actually describes an exercise, seeing with the eyes of Lynceus. It's named after a Greek myth. That you learn to look at things around you and see their forms, and see that the forms are there. See that the Fibonacci sequence is in the tree, or see that it's in a picture of a galaxy, right? The spiral galaxies, spiral hurricanes, all kinds of formations like that are based on Fibonacci sequences. But if you just look at a tree and you see the Fibonacci sequences there, you see that the numbers are there, and you see that, right, mathematical structure is there. Then you see that, being itself is there, and, non-being has negated itself right there. Right? This isn't something that happens somewhere out in outer space or heaven. It's right in front of you, and you're part of it, right? And so I think that gives a depth and a richness to the world, right? Where you're not just looking at the world as being a very flat surface of colors or sounds or shapes, but it has this extraordinary depth to it, right? A depth that just goes all the way into the heart of reality, everywhere, right? And you don't have to you don't have to think that this happened someplace else, like nothingness is out there somewhere in a black hole or outer space or something. It's right in front. It's the self-negation of non-being is right in front of you, right? And it's within you. It's happening within you. It's happening around you. And this, I think, can start to give you a deeper way of appreciating the richness of the world. So that would be my hope.
Wow, what a beautiful way to end the conversation. But before I let you go, Professor Steinhart, where would you want people to go to interact with you, to connect, to read your books? What would be the best sort of places you want to send people to online?
The best place would be my website, which is just ericsteinhart.com, ERICSTEINHART.com. I post as much of my writing there as I legally can. And the book, Ritual Kindles Vision, that's just there for free, for a free download, right? Because I do, again, I am a professor, so I got to write academic books, and unfortunately those can be prohibitively expensive. But so I wanted to be able to write something that people could just have for free. So that's there. But any article or anything like that I can post there is there. So there's lots of resources. That's where I would tell people to go.
Amazing. Well, listener, viewer, you know where to go check out next. And Professor Steinhart, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a fascinating conversation.
All right. Well, thanks for having me here.
Thanks for checking out this episode. Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And make sure you check us out over on Locals. Cheers.